Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Danny Rodriguez had been driving trucks for 15 years. California to Chicago runs were his bread and butter. He'd seen everything the road could throw at him, or so he thought. February 2019, Interstate 80 through Wyoming. It was the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. -5 degrees with snow turning the highway into a skating rink. Danny was running behind schedule, pushing through the darkness at 50 miles per hour when he first noticed them in his mirrors. 3 trucks, perfect formation, quarter-mile back. At first, he didn't think much of it. Truckers convoy together in bad weather all the time, safety in numbers. But as the miles passed, something felt wrong. The trucks matched his every move. When he slowed down, they slowed down. When he sped up, they sped up, like they were tethered to him by an invisible rope. Danny tried his CB radio. "Hey, convoy behind me. You guys copy?" Nothing but static. He tried again. "This is eastbound driver at mile marker 235. 3 trucks running behind me. You guys there?" Still nothing. The radio was dead silent except for occasional bursts of static that almost sounded like whispered voices if you listened too closely. When Danny crested a hill near mile marker 240, he got his first clear look at them. Older models, 80s or 90s trucks, the kind you don't see much anymore. And despite the freezing weather and blowing snow, none of them had their running lights on. Just headlights cutting through the darkness like 6 glowing eyes. That's when Danny realized he hadn't seen any other traffic for over an hour. On I-80, even at midnight, you'd expect to see someone. But the highway was completely empty except for Danny and his escorts. He decided to test them, pulled into a rest area at mile marker 250, thinking they'd either stop or keep going. Instead, they slowed down and parked in a line at the far end of the lot. Engines running, headlights still on. Danny could see silhouettes in each cab, but they weren't moving, just sitting there, watching. The rest area felt wrong. Despite being a major stop on a heavily traveled interstate, it was completely deserted. The building that housed the restrooms was dark, with a handwritten sign taped to the door. Closed until further notice. Danny climbed back in his cab and got the hell out of there. The 3 trucks followed immediately, falling back into their perfect formation exactly a quarter-mile behind him. This continued for another 50 miles through small towns that should have shown signs of life but appeared completely abandoned. Around 3 in the morning, Danny's engine started sputtering. Temperature gauge climbing toward the red zone. The smell of burning coolant filled the cab. Any trucker will tell you, losing your engine in the middle of nowhere in sub-zero weather isn't just an inconvenience, it can be a death sentence. Danny managed to coast to the top of a grade before the engine died completely. He rolled to a stop on the shoulder. Hazard lights flashing. The 3 trucks that had been following him didn't stop. They passed him at regular highway speed, and as each one went by, Danny got his first clear look at the drivers. The cabs were empty. No one behind the wheel. No movement inside. The trucks were driving themselves, or being driven by something Danny couldn't see. As the 3rd truck passed, Danny noticed something painted on the back of the trailer in faded letters. Westbound Freight Company. Danny knew that name. Westbound Freight had been a small trucking company that operated out of Wyoming in the 80s. The company had shut down after 3 of their drivers disappeared during a blizzard in 1987. Their trucks were found abandoned on Interstate 80 with no trace of what had happened to the men. Danny sat in his dead truck watching the taillights disappear. The temperature inside his cab was already dropping. He knew he had maybe an hour before hypothermia became a real concern. He tried his CB radio again. This time he heard something that made his skin crawl. Voices, 3 men discussing the weather, road conditions, their delivery schedule. The conversation sounded normal except for one thing. They were talking about road conditions and truck stops that had changed decades ago. They mentioned a truck stop in Cheyenne that had been demolished in the early 2000s as if it were still open. Then one of the voices said something that made Danny's heart stop. "We've got a driver broken down at mile marker 285. Should we go back and help him?" Another voice responded, "Nah, let him freeze. We've got a schedule to keep." The third voice laughed, a sound like wind howling through a graveyard. "He'll be joining us soon enough anyway." They were talking about him. The radio crackled again, and one of the voices spoke directly to him. "Don't worry, Danny. The cold isn't so bad once you get used to it. We've been driving these roads for 37 years now, and the winter nights don't bother us anymore." That's when Danny saw headlights approaching from behind. Not steady beams, but flickering, wavering lights that seemed to dance in the darkness. The 3 trucks were coming back for him, driving in reverse down the interstate at a highway speed. As they got closer, Danny could see the trucks looked wrong. Paint faded and rusted, chrome tarnished, ice crystals covering the windshields despite the fact that their engines were running. The lead truck stopped directly behind Danny's trailer. He heard the sound of a door slamming, footsteps crunching through the snow toward his cab. But when Danny looked in his mirrors, he couldn't see anyone walking. The footsteps stopped at his driver's side door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks echoed in the frigid air. A voice called out, muffled by the wind but clearly audible. "Engine trouble, friend. We can give you a ride. We know these roads real well. Been driving them longer than most folks have been alive." The voice sounded friendly enough, but there was something wrong with it, something that made Danny think of frozen vocal cords and lips blue with frostbite. Danny didn't answer. Every instinct he'd developed in 15 years of trucking was screaming at him not to open that door. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Come on, Danny. Don't be rude. We know you're in there, and we know you're getting mighty cold. Open up and we'll get you warmed up real nice." The temperature in Danny's cab continued to drop. He was shivering uncontrollably. He knew his mysterious visitors were right. He wouldn't last much longer in the cold. But something told him that accepting their help would be far worse than freezing to death. That's when Danny heard another engine approaching from the east. Real headlights, steady, warm, normal, cut through the darkness as a Wyoming state trooper pulled up behind the phantom convoy. Danny watched in his mirrors as the patrol car's emergency lights began flashing, illuminating the 3 trucks. But in the red and blue strobing light, Danny could see that the trucks were different now. Paint completely faded, tires flat and cracked, frost covering every surface, and he could see through the windows of the cabs to the seats beyond. The trucks were empty. The trooper's PA system crackled to life. "Driver of the disabled vehicle, this is Wyoming State Police. Are you all right in there?" Danny had never been so happy to hear another human voice in his life. He grabbed his CB radio. "I'm okay, officer. Engine overheated, but there are 3 trucks here that—" Danny looked in his mirrors again. The trucks were gone, vanished completely, as if they had never been there. The trooper spent the next 2 hours helping Danny get his truck running again, a simple fix involving a loose coolant hose that shouldn't have caused complete engine failure. As they worked, Danny told the officer about the 3 trucks. The trooper listened without commenting until Danny finished his story. Then the officer said something that still haunts Danny to this day. "You're not the first driver to report seeing westbound freight trucks on this stretch of highway. We get maybe 3 or 4 reports a year, always during winter storms, always involving drivers who break down around mile marker 285. The strange thing is, we investigated the original disappearance of those westbound drivers back in '87. Found their trucks right here in this exact spot, with the engines running and the heaters on full blast. But the cabs were frozen solid inside like they'd been sitting empty in the cold for days." Danny got his truck running and completed his delivery to Chicago. But he's never driven that stretch of I-80 through Wyoming again, especially not in winter. He switched to a southern route that adds 2 days to his cross-country runs. But as Danny puts it, 2 extra days of driving is a small price to pay to avoid spending eternity in a convoy of dead truckers. The Wyoming State Police confirmed they have files on 17 similar encounters over the past 32 years. 17 drivers who broke down at mile marker 285 and reported being approached by the phantom westbound freight convoy. Of those 17 drivers, 3 were never seen again. Their trucks were found in the same condition as the original westbound vehicles, engines running, heaters on, cabs frozen solid. No trace of the drivers. Lisa Patterson had been driving trucks for 8 years and prided herself on knowing every major road across the country like the back of her hand. She could navigate from Seattle to Miami without ever looking at a GPS. August 2021. Lisa was hauling furniture from North Carolina to Texas when she hit unexpected construction near the Tennessee-Arkansas border. The highway was completely shut down, and detour signs directed traffic onto a series of back roads. Lisa had driven this detour once before, maybe 2 years earlier, so she wasn't particularly concerned. What she didn't realize was that road construction and rural development had changed the area significantly. The detour signs she was following were actually leftovers from a previous project that should have been removed months earlier. By the time Lisa realized she was lost, she'd been driving on increasingly narrow country roads for over an hour. Her GPS had lost signal. Her CB radio picked up nothing but static. The roads she was traveling weren't even marked on her atlas. The landscape around her was unsettling. Trees on both sides created a tunnel effect that blocked out most of the moonlight. Farmhouses appeared abandoned with broken windows and overgrown yards, but with fresh tire tracks in their driveways. Fields that should have been full of crops were covered with dead vegetation that looked like it had been burned or poisoned. Lisa's first instinct was to turn around and backtrack, but the roads were too narrow for a semi to make a U-turn. She continued forward, looking for a wide spot to maneuver. That's when she began to notice she was passing the same landmarks repeatedly. A rusted mailbox shaped like a cow, a dead tree with distinctive twisted branches, a red barn with half its roof missing. At first, Lisa thought she was just confused that the rural landscape was making similar features seem identical, but when she passed the cow-shaped mailbox for the 4th time, she knew something was seriously wrong. According to her odometer, she'd been driving for 2 hours since leaving the interstate, but somehow she was traveling in a circle on roads that should have been leading her in a straight line. Lisa decided to stop at the next house that showed signs of life. Getting home safely was more important than her ego. The first house was a small white farmhouse with a porch light on and what appeared to be a television flickering through the front window. Lisa pulled into the gravel driveway and walked up to the front door. When she knocked, the television sound stopped immediately. But no one came to the door. Lisa could see the lights were on inside. She was certain she'd seen movement through the window as she approached. She knocked again, louder this time. "Excuse me, I'm a truck driver and I'm lost. Could you help me with directions?" Still no response. But Lisa could hear what sounded like whispering coming from inside the house. As Lisa turned to leave, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There were children's toys scattered around the front yard, a tricycle, some dolls, a sandbox filled with sand. But the toys were covered in a thick layer of dust and dirt, as if they'd been sitting outside for years. The sandbox was filled not just with sand, but with dead insects and what looked like small animal bones. Lisa hurried back to her truck and continued down the road, but every house she passed showed the same pattern. Lights on, signs of recent activity, but no one would answer the door. And all of them had children's toys in the yards. Toys that looked like they'd been abandoned for years, but were arranged as if children had just finished playing with them. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger with each mile. Lisa kept checking her mirrors, but there was never any traffic behind her. Yet she couldn't shake the sensation that something was pacing her truck just outside the range of her headlights. It was around 2 in the morning when Lisa encountered the first person she'd seen since leaving the interstate. A woman was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by Lisa's headlights. She appeared to be middle-aged, wearing a white nightgown that was stained with what looked like mud or dried blood. The woman wasn't moving, wasn't waving for help, wasn't trying to get out of the way. She was just standing there, staring directly at Lisa's truck. Lisa slowed down and came to a stop about 20 feet from the woman. She rolled down her window. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. Didn't even acknowledge that Lisa had spoken. She continued staring at the truck with an expression that Lisa later described as hungry, like she was looking at a meal instead of a person. After several minutes of trying to communicate, Lisa decided to carefully drive around her. But as she began to move, the woman moved as well, always positioning herself directly in front of the truck. The woman's movements were strange and unnatural. She would glide from one side of the road to the other without appearing to take steps, and her feet never seemed to quite touch the ground. Lisa decided to back up and find another route. But when she put the truck in reverse and checked her mirrors, she discovered there were now more people standing behind her truck. At least 6 figures in similar stained nightgowns, all standing perfectly still, all staring at her truck with the same hungry expression. Lisa was surrounded. That's when her truck's engine started running rough, RPMs fluctuating wildly. She could smell something burning. Temperature gauge climbing toward the red zone, oil pressure dropping. Lisa had maintained this truck meticulously for 3 years. It had never given her a moment's trouble. The mechanical failures were too sudden and too severe to be coincidental. The figures around her truck began to move closer, closing the circle. Lisa could see their faces, more clearly now in her headlights. Their skin was pale and waxy, like candle wax that had been melted and reformed. Their eyes were completely black with no visible pupils or irises, and when they opened their mouths, Lisa could see that their teeth were sharp and pointed like a shark's teeth, but arranged in human jaws. Lisa made a desperate decision. She gunned the engine and drove straight toward the woman in front of her truck, hoping to either scare her into moving or push through if necessary. But as the truck approached, the woman simply vanished. Not moved aside, not jumped away, literally disappeared like smoke. The other figures did the same, melting away into the darkness as if they'd never been there. Lisa's truck suddenly roared back to life, all the mechanical problems disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. She floored the accelerator and raced down the road, not caring about the narrow turns or steep hills, focused only on getting as far away from those figures as possible. Behind her, she could hear what sounded like screaming, but it was coming from the trees on both sides of the road, following her as she drove. After 20 minutes of driving at dangerous speeds through the winding roads, Lisa saw something that almost made her cry with relief. A sign indicating she was approaching Highway 67. She followed the signs and found herself back on a major road with normal traffic and functioning streetlights. Her GPS immediately picked up a signal. Her CB radio crackled back to life with the familiar chatter of other truckers in the area. Lisa stopped at the first truck stop she found and called the Arkansas State Police to report what she'd experienced. The dispatcher was polite but seemed unsurprised by her story. He took down her information and the approximate location where she'd gotten lost, then told her something that still gives her nightmares. "Ma'am, you're the 7th driver this year to report getting lost on those roads and encountering people in nightgowns. We've sent patrol cars to investigate, but we can never find the roads that drivers describe. According to our maps and GPS systems, there's nothing in that area but dense forest." The dispatcher explained that the area Lisa had driven through was the former location of a small rural community called Millfield, which had been abandoned in the 70s after a chemical plant explosion contaminated the groundwater. The entire town had been evacuated, and the government had eventually razed all the buildings and let the forest reclaim the land. But truckers, hikers, and other travelers continued to report encounters with the former residents of Millfield, people who seemed to be unaware that their town no longer existed. Lisa researched the history of Millfield when she got home. She discovered that the chemical plant explosion had happened at night while most of the town's residents were sleeping. Over 200 people had died from chemical exposure, most of them found in their beds wearing nightgowns and pajamas. The contamination had been so severe that the bodies couldn't be moved for weeks. By the time cleanup crews arrived, many of the victims had been altered by the chemicals in ways that official reports described only as significant physical changes to deceased individuals. Lisa never took that route through Arkansas again. She's also noticed that other truckers who know the area avoid discussing those back roads. When pressed for details, they change the subject quickly. It's as if there's an unspoken understanding among drivers that some places are best left undiscovered, and some roads lead to destinations that no living person should visit. 3 weeks after her encounter, Lisa received a package at her home address, a package with no return address, and a postmark from a post office that had been closed since 1978. Inside the package was a child's doll, identical to one of the toys she'd seen in the yard of the first house where she'd stopped for directions. The doll was wearing a miniature nightgown stained with the same dark substance she'd seen on the figures in the road. Attached to the doll was a handwritten note in faded ink. "Thank you for visiting Millfield. We hope you'll come back soon. We get so few visitors these days, and we're always looking for new residents to join our community." The note was signed with dozens of names written in different handwritings, as if the entire town had contributed to the message. Lisa threw the doll away immediately, but the next morning it was back on her doorstep. She burned it in her backyard. But within a week, she received another package containing an identical doll with the same note. This has continued for over 2 years now. Lisa receives a new doll every few weeks. She's moved twice since the initial incident, but somehow the packages always find her. Marcus Thompson had been using the same CB radio for over 12 years. A reliable Cobra 29 that had never given him any trouble and had been his constant companion through countless lonely nights on the road. March 2020. Marcus was hauling auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix, traveling through a particularly desolate stretch of Interstate 40 in New Mexico around 11 at night when his CB crackled to life with a transmission that immediately caught his attention. "Eastbound driver in the white Peterbilt, this is your shadow. You've got a problem with your left rear trailer tire. Better pull over and check it before you have a blowout." Marcus looked in his mirrors but couldn't see any trucks behind him. The highway was completely empty in both directions. He was driving a white Peterbilt, so the description was accurate, but Marcus couldn't figure out how someone could see his truck when there was no other traffic visible. Still, tire safety isn't something any trucker takes lightly. Marcus decided to pull over at the next wide spot and do a quick inspection. When Marcus walked around his trailer with a flashlight, he discovered that his left rear tire was indeed developing a dangerous bulge on the sidewall, the kind of defect that could cause a catastrophic blowout at highway speeds. The tire needed to be changed immediately. Marcus was grateful for the warning, but he was puzzled about who had given it to him and how they'd been able to see his truck so clearly when he couldn't see them. Marcus keyed his CB radio. "Hey, Shadow, this is the white Pete you warned about the tire. You were absolutely right. I've got a bad sidewall bulge. I want to thank you for the heads up. Where are you running? I don't see any trucks in either direction." The response came immediately. "Don't worry about where I am, driver. Just focus on getting that tire changed safely. You've got about 40 minutes before that sidewall gives out completely." The precision of the warning was unsettling. Marcus had seen plenty of tire failures in his career, and predicting exactly when a sidewall would fail was nearly impossible, even for experienced mechanics. Yet something about the voice on the radio conveyed absolute certainty, as if the speaker had somehow already witnessed the tire failure and was working backward from that knowledge. As Marcus worked to change the tire, the voice continued to provide commentary and guidance. "You'll want to double-check those lug nuts. The third one from the top is still loose." Marcus checked. Sure enough, he'd missed tightening one of the nuts properly. "There's a state trooper about 15 miles ahead running radar, so keep it under 70 when you get back on the road." Every piece of information the voice provided turned out to be completely accurate. But the most disturbing part was what the voice knew about Marcus personally. "How's your daughter Sarah doing with her nursing program? Must be tough having her so far away at school." Marcus had never mentioned his daughter on the CB radio, and Sarah was indeed studying nursing at a university 800 miles from home. The voice continued, "That chest pain you've been having, you really should see a doctor about that when you get home. It's not just heartburn like you keep telling yourself." Marcus had been experiencing occasional chest discomfort for several weeks, but hadn't mentioned it to anyone, not even his wife. He'd been attributing it to stress and poor truck stop food. As Marcus finished changing the tire and prepared to get back on the road, he tried once more to identify his helpful but mysterious companion. "Shadow, I really appreciate all your help tonight. What's your handle? Maybe we can stay in touch." The response came after a long pause. "My handle used to be Night Rider, but I don't use that anymore. Haven't used it since the accident." Marcus asked what accident, but the voice seemed reluctant to elaborate. Finally, after several minutes of silence, the response came. "Happened right here, Marcus. Same stretch of a highway, same time of night. Tire blowout at a mile marker 127. Lost control and went off the road. That was, let me see, about 6 years ago now. You'll see the cross marker when you pass mile marker 127. White cross with some plastic flowers that my wife put there." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The voice was claiming to be that of a dead trucker, someone who had died in the exact type of accident that Marcus had just avoided. As Marcus drove past mile marker 127, his headlights illuminated a white wooden cross on the side of the highway, exactly where the voice had said it would be. Plastic flowers, faded by years of weather, were attached to the cross. Marcus pulled over and walked to the marker. He found a small metal plate with an inscription, "Thomas Night Rider, Williams, 1962-2014. Beloved husband and father, keep the shiny side up." Marcus's hands were shaking as he keyed his CB radio one final time. "Night Rider, are you still out there?" The response came through clearly, but with a sadness that seemed to echo across the desert. "I'm always out here, Marcus. This highway, it holds on to some of us. I couldn't help myself that night, but maybe I can help other drivers avoid the same fate. Take care of yourself and get that chest looked at. Your daughter needs her dad around for a long time." The radio went silent after that. Marcus never heard from Night Rider again. But when Marcus got home to Michigan 3 days later, he made an appointment with his doctor. The tests revealed a serious heart condition that required immediate surgery. According to his cardiologist, if Marcus had continued to ignore the symptoms for even a few more weeks, he likely would have suffered a massive heart attack while driving. Marcus researched Thomas Williams and discovered that he had indeed been a trucker who died in a single-vehicle accident at mile marker 127 in 2014. Williams had been driving for over 20 years and was known among other truckers for his willingness to help fellow drivers with mechanical problems and road advice. His wife confirmed that his CB handle had been Night Rider and that he'd been driving a route from Detroit to Phoenix when the accident occurred. The most chilling detail Marcus discovered was that Thomas Williams had died exactly 6 years to the day before Marcus's encounter with the voice on Channel 19, July 1st. Every year's the anniversary of his death, the New Mexico State Police receive reports from truckers claiming to have received warnings about road hazards from someone calling himself Night Rider near mile marker 127. The warnings are always accurate, and they've prevented dozens of accidents over the years. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. Angela Rivera had been hauling freight for 9 years and had a strict personal policy of never picking up strangers. That policy almost saved her life on a brutal winter night in North Dakota. January 2022. Angela was driving eastbound toward Fargo with a load of farming equipment when the storm hit with a vengeance. Visibility dropped to almost zero. The wind was howling across the plains with such force that it was pushing her 60,000-pound truck sideways on the highway. Angela had slowed to about 30 miles per hour and was considering pulling over to wait out the worst of the storm when she saw a figure standing beside the road. It was a young woman, maybe early 20s, wearing nothing but jeans and a thin jacket that was completely inadequate for the sub-zero temperatures. She wasn't actively trying to flag down traffic, just standing there in the blowing snow about 10 feet from the roadway. Angela's first instinct was to keep driving. Her company had strict policies against picking up hitchhikers, and she'd never broken that rule, but something about the sight of this girl standing in a deadly blizzard without proper clothing made Angela reconsider. The temperature outside was 20 below zero, with a wind chill that made it feel like 40 below. No one could survive long in those conditions without proper shelter. Angela pulled over about 50 yards past where the girl was standing and sat in her idling truck for several minutes, debating what to do. Angela finally made the decision that probably saved both their lives. She decided to at least offer the girl a ride to the next town, which was about 40 miles ahead. Angela put the truck in reverse and backed up to where the girl was standing. She rolled down her passenger window. "Hey, do you need help? It's dangerous to be out in this weather." The girl looked up at Angela with what appeared to be genuine relief and gratitude. She was young, blonde, and pretty, but her lips were already blue from the cold, and she was shivering uncontrollably. "My car broke down about a mile back," the girl called out over the wind. "I've been walking for almost an hour trying to find help. Could you give me a ride to the next town? I can pay you." Angela hesitated for another moment, then unlocked the passenger door. The girl climbed up into the cab, bringing with her a blast of frigid air and the smell of something Angela couldn't quite identify. Something sweet and cloying, like flowers that had been left too long in water. The girl introduced herself as Jennifer and explained that her car had slid off the road into a ditch. She said she'd tried calling for help, but her phone had died, and the storm was getting worse by the minute. Angela felt sorry for her and was glad she'd decided to help. Jennifer seemed polite and grateful. As they drove through the storm, Angela tried to make conversation to help pass the time, but Jennifer's responses were strange and disjointed. When Angela asked where she was from, Jennifer said, "Around here." But when pressed for specifics, she couldn't name any local towns or landmarks. When Angela asked about her family, Jennifer said she'd been visiting relatives but couldn't remember their names or exactly where they lived. What really began to concern Angela was Jennifer's physical state. Despite having been standing in sub-zero weather for over an hour, Jennifer wasn't warming up. Even with the truck's heater running at full blast, Jennifer continued to shiver and her lips remained blue. When Angela offered her a blanket from her sleeper berth, Jennifer's skin felt ice cold to the touch, as if the cold had penetrated so deeply that even artificial heat couldn't warm her. About 20 miles down the road, Angela noticed something that made her stomach drop. In her side mirror, she could see another set of headlights following behind them, staying at a consistent distance despite the poor visibility and dangerous road conditions. When Angela slowed down, the trailing vehicle slowed down, When she sped up slightly, it matched her pace. Angela had learned to trust her instincts during her years on the road, and something about this situation felt like a setup. Angela decided to test her suspicions. She told Jennifer that she needed to stop at a way station that was coming up in a few miles to check her load securement. Jennifer's reaction was immediate and alarming. She became agitated and insisted that they needed to keep driving, that stopping would be dangerous in the storm. When Angela explained that it would only take a few minutes, Jennifer grabbed Angela's arm with surprising strength. "No, we can't stop. They're waiting for us to stop." Angela asked who they were, but Jennifer just stared out the passenger window and muttered something about needing to keep moving. That's when Angela noticed that Jennifer wasn't breathing normally. Her chest wasn't rising and falling the way it should. When Angela looked closely, she realized that Jennifer wasn't breathing at all. No visible breath in the frigid air. No fogging of the windows. Nothing. The realization hit Angela like a physical blow. Jennifer wasn't alive. Whatever was sitting in her passenger seat was something else entirely. Something that was using Jennifer's appearance to gain Angela's trust and cooperation. Angela fought to keep her expression neutral while her mind raced through her options. She was alone on a deserted highway in a blizzard with something inhuman sitting 3 feet away from her. Angela decided to play along while she figured out an escape plan. She continued driving toward the truck stop she'd mentioned, but as they got closer, Jennifer became increasingly agitated. She kept looking in the mirrors and muttering about them catching up. Finally, Jennifer turned to Angela with an expression that was no longer human. Her eyes had gone completely black, and when she smiled, Angela could see that her teeth were sharp and pointed. "You know what I am, don't you?" Jennifer said in a voice that was no longer quite human. "I can smell your fear. It's delicious." Angela's blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to keep driving steadily toward the truck stop. Jennifer continued talking, and what she said next explained everything. "We've been hunting this highway for 3 winters now. I stand in the cold to attract the sympathetic ones, the drivers who can't resist helping someone in distress. Then my friends follow us until we reach an isolated spot where they can take the truck and the cargo. Usually we let the drivers go afterward, but lately we've been getting hungrier." Angela realized that the headlights following them belonged to Jennifer's accomplices and that she was being led into a trap. But she also realized that Jennifer had made a crucial mistake. She'd revealed that there was an afterward for some drivers, which meant that not all of their victims were killed immediately. As they approached the truck stop, Angela could see that it was well lit and appeared to be open with several other trucks parked in the lot. Jennifer became increasingly frantic, insisting that they needed to drive past it and continue to a more private location. Angela ignored her protests and pulled into the truck stop parking lot, driving directly toward the main building where the lights were brightest. Jennifer made her final threat. "If you don't drive away from here right now, I'll kill you where you sit." But Angela had noticed something important. Jennifer hadn't touched the door handle since getting into the truck, and she seemed unable to operate any of the truck's controls. Whatever Jennifer was, she appeared to be bound by some kind of rules that prevented her from harming Angela while they were inside the truck or on public property. Angela pulled up directly in front of the truck stop's main entrance and immediately began honking her horn repeatedly. Within seconds, other truckers and truck stop employees were coming outside to see what the emergency was. Angela pointed at Jennifer and shouted, "This isn't human! She's been trying to lure me into a trap!" Jennifer let out a shriek that shattered both side windows of the truck, then simply vanished, not opened the door and ran, but literally disappeared like smoke. The temperature in the cab immediately returned to normal, and the sweet, cloying smell that had been bothering Angela dissipated instantly. The other truckers helped Angela contact the police. When the officers arrived, they found something disturbing in the truck stop's security camera footage. The cameras clearly showed Angela's truck pulling up and Angela getting out, but they showed no passenger in the truck at any point. According to the video evidence, Angela had been alone in her truck the entire time. Even more disturbing was what the police discovered when they investigated Angela's route. There was indeed a car in a ditch about a mile from where Angela had picked up Jennifer, but it had been there for over 6 months. The car was registered to a Jennifer Walsh, a 22-year-old college student who had disappeared during a blizzard the previous winter. Her body was found in the car, frozen solid, still wearing the same jeans and thin jacket that the hitchhiker had been wearing. The police confirmed that Angela was the 4th trucker in 2 years to report picking up a hitchhiker matching Jennifer's description on that same stretch of highway during winter storms. In each case, the drivers reported being followed by mysterious vehicles and feeling like they were being led into a trap. The 3 previous drivers had all managed to escape by stopping at public locations, but 2 other truckers had disappeared completely on that highway during the same time period. Their trucks were found abandoned with no trace of the drivers. Angela learned that Highway 2 through North Dakota has one of the highest rates of missing trucker cases in the country, with over a dozen drivers vanishing without explanation in the past 5 years. Local law enforcement believes there's an organized group using supernatural bait to lure truckers into isolated areas, but they've never been able to catch the perpetrators or determine exactly how they're operating. Angela still drives that route occasionally, but never during winter storms. She's installed additional security cameras in her truck that record both the interior and exterior. She's also joined a network of truckers who share real-time information about suspicious activity on the dangerous routes. Most importantly, she's never again considered breaking her rule about picking up hitchhikers, no matter how desperate their situation appears to be. The final chilling detail of Angela's story is what she discovered when she researched Jennifer Walsh's disappearance. According to police reports, Jennifer had been driving to visit relatives when her car went off the road during the blizzard. But here's the thing that keeps Angela awake at night. Jennifer Walsh had been driving westbound when she crashed, but the hitchhiker claiming to be Jennifer had been standing on the eastbound side of the highway, as if she was trying to retrace her route in the opposite direction, luring drivers back toward the location where she had died. Carl Matthews had been driving cross-country for 15 years and prided himself on being professional and reliable. Carl was the kind of driver that companies trusted with their most valuable and sensitive shipments. September 2021. Carl received a call from his dispatcher about a special delivery that needed to be handled with absolute discretion. The cargo was a single shipping container that needed to be transported from a private warehouse outside Memphis to a research facility in Colorado. The pay was exceptional, almost 3 times his normal rate. The only requirements were that Carl could not open the container under any circumstances. He had to drive straight through without extended stops, and he could not discuss the cargo with anyone. The pickup location was unusual from the start. Instead of a normal loading dock, Carl was directed to an isolated warehouse complex about 30 miles outside Memphis, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. The facility looked more like a government installation than a commercial shipping operation. Carl was met by men in dark suits who checked his identification multiple times and had him sign several confidentiality agreements before allowing him onto the property. The container itself was unlike anything Carl had ever hauled. It was a standard 20-foot shipping container on the outside, but it had been heavily modified with additional locks, reinforcement plates, and what appeared to be some kind of ventilation system. Most unsettling of all, the container was equipped with temperature monitoring equipment and what looked like motion sensors attached to the exterior walls. The men loading the container were extremely careful and methodical, using specialized equipment to secure it to Carl's trailer. They tested the restraint systems multiple times and gave Carl a sealed envelope containing his delivery instructions, which he was told not to open until he was 50 miles from the pickup location. Carl began his journey toward Colorado, and for the first few hours, everything seemed normal. But about 4 hours into the trip, as evening was approaching, Carl began to notice strange sounds coming from his trailer. At first, he attributed the noises to normal road vibration and cargo shifting. But as he listened more carefully, the sounds seemed deliberate and rhythmic. It sounded like something was moving around inside the container, not sliding or rolling like loose cargo, but moving with purpose. Carl tried to dismiss his concerns, but the sounds continued and became more pronounced as darkness fell. He could hear what sounded like scratching or scraping against the interior walls of the container, always from the same location near the front of the trailer. The scratching would continue for several minutes, then stop completely, then resume with more intensity. Around 10 at night, Carl stopped at a truck stop in Kansas to refuel. As he walked around his truck doing his routine safety inspection, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were small droplets of what appeared to be blood seeping from the bottom seal of the container. Not a lot, just a few drops here and there, but enough to form small puddles beneath the trailer. Carl's first instinct was to call his dispatcher, but the confidentiality agreements he'd signed specifically prohibited him from contacting anyone about the cargo except in case of a major emergency. Carl wasn't sure if a few drops of what might be blood constituted a major emergency, especially since the container itself appeared to be secure and undamaged. Carl decided to continue driving, but he kept his CB radio tuned to channel 19 and his cell phone ready in case he needed to call for help. The scratching sounds from the container continued throughout the night, sometimes becoming so loud that Carl could hear them over his engine noise and road sound. What was even more disturbing was that the sounds seemed to respond to external stimuli. Whenever Carl hit his brakes or changed lanes, the scratching would become more frantic, as if whatever was inside the container could sense the truck's movements. Around 3 in the morning, Carl encountered something that still haunts him to this day. His truck's motion sensors began registering movement on the trailer, not the normal vibration of road travel, but distinct motion as if something heavy was moving around inside the container. Carl's truck was equipped with a sophisticated load monitoring system that could detect cargo shifts. According to the sensors, something weighing approximately 200 pounds was moving freely inside the supposedly sealed container. Carl pulled over at a rest area to investigate, but as soon as the truck came to a complete stop, all movement inside the container ceased. The scratching stopped. The motion sensors returned to normal. Everything became eerily quiet. Carl walked around the trailer with a flashlight, and that's when he discovered something that made him question everything he thought he knew about his cargo. There were handprints on the outside of the container, human handprints pressed against the metal from the inside with such force that they'd created visible impressions on the exterior walls. The prints were concentrated around what would have been eye level for an adult, as if someone inside the container had been trying to push their way out. Most disturbing of all, the handprints appeared to be fresh, with traces of moisture that looked like perspiration or condensation from human skin. Carl immediately called the emergency number he'd been given for the shipping company, but the phone rang endlessly with no answer. He tried calling his dispatcher, but got only a message saying the number was no longer in service. Carl was beginning to realize that he might have been deceived about the nature of his cargo and that he might be involved in something illegal or dangerous. That's when Carl heard the voice. It was muffled and distorted by the container walls, but it was definitely human. A man's voice calling out, "Help me! Please help me! I don't know where I am. Please don't leave me in here." The voice was weak and desperate, like someone who'd been trapped for days without food or water. Carl tried to respond, calling out, "I'm going to get you out of there. Can you tell me how many people are in the container with you?" The response chilled him to the bone. "There are 3 of us left. There were more, but they didn't make it. Please hurry. We don't have much time left." Carl realized that he was transporting kidnapped people and that some of them had already died during the journey. He immediately called 911 and reported his location and situation to Colorado State Police. Within 20 minutes, police and emergency vehicles had surrounded the rest area, and a specialized hazmat team began working to open the container safely. What they found inside defied explanation and contradicted everything Carl thought he knew about his cargo. The container was completely empty, except for a sophisticated climate control system and what appeared to be medical monitoring equipment. There were no people, living or dead, inside the container, but there was evidence that people had been inside recently. Personal belongings, food wrappers, what appeared to be makeshift bedding in one corner. Most disturbing of all, the monitoring equipment inside the container was still recording vital signs: heart rates, breathing patterns, and brain activity for 3 distinct individuals. According to the medical readouts, 3 people were alive and conscious inside the container, but there was no one there. The equipment was detecting the presence of people who couldn't be seen or found. The police investigation revealed that Carl had been hired by a shell company with connections to illegal human trafficking operations, but the organization disappeared completely after Carl's arrest. The warehouse where he'd picked up the container was found abandoned with no trace of the men who'd loaded his truck. Most mysteriously, there was no record of the container ever existing. The serial numbers were fake, and the shipping documents Carl had been given were sophisticated forgeries. Carl was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing when investigators confirmed that he'd been deceived and manipulated by the trafficking organization. But the case was never solved, and the fate of the people whose voices Carl heard and whose vital signs were detected by the monitoring equipment remains unknown. Carl retired from long-haul trucking immediately after the incident and now works for a local delivery company that only handles verified cargo with full transparency about contents and destinations. The most chilling aspect of Carl's story is what happened 6 months after the incident. He received a package at his home with no return address, containing a USB drive with video footage from inside the container during his journey. The footage shows 3 people, 2 men and a woman, trapped inside the container. But the timestamps on the video correspond exactly to the period when police found the container empty. The people in the video are calling out for help and mentioning Carl by name, asking him to stop and let them out. Carl turned the USB drive over to federal investigators, but they've been unable to explain how the video was created or where the people shown in the footage are now. The investigation remains open, and the FBI continues to receive reports of truckers being hired for similar mysterious deliveries involving sealed containers and unusually high pay rates. Rebecca Santos had been driving professionally for 11 years and knew virtually every major truck stop between California and New York. So when she pulled into what appeared to be a new facility on Interstate 70 in Missouri, she thought she'd simply discovered a recently opened location. It was 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in October 2021 when Rebecca spotted the truck stop signs advertising Big Jim's 24-hour plaza, next exit, all services available. Rebecca had driven this route dozens of times over the years and didn't remember seeing this particular truck stop before. But new facilities were always opening, and the signs looked professional and legitimate. Rebecca needed fuel and a break, so she decided to check it out. The truck stop appeared completely normal from the highway. Bright lights, a large parking area with plenty of space for big rigs, and a modern-looking main building with a typical convenience store and restaurant setup. Rebecca pulled into the fuel island and noticed that despite being well past midnight, the place was busy with other truckers, fueling up and moving through the lot. Everything seemed perfectly routine. Rebecca began fueling her truck and noticed that the diesel price was significantly lower than what she'd been seeing at other stops, almost 40 cents per gallon cheaper than the national average. When she mentioned this to the attendant who came out to clean her windshield, he smiled and said, "We keep our prices low to build customer loyalty. Once you stop here, you'll want to come back." Something about the way he said it made Rebecca slightly uncomfortable, but she appreciated the savings and decided to go inside to grab some coffee and snacks. The interior of the truck stop was impressive. Clean, well-stocked, and modern, with a restaurant section that was serving hot food despite the late hour. Rebecca noticed that there were quite a few other truckers inside, some eating at the restaurant, others browsing the merchandise aisles, and several more just sitting in the seating area drinking coffee. What struck Rebecca as odd was how quiet everyone was. There was none of the usual trucker conversation and camaraderie that you'd expect to find at a busy truck stop. Rebecca grabbed her items and approached the checkout counter where a friendly middle-aged woman rang up her purchases. As the clerk was processing her payment, she asked Rebecca, "Will you be staying with us tonight? We have excellent sleeping facilities, and many of our customers find that once they rest here, they don't want to leave." Rebecca politely declined, explaining that she preferred to sleep in her own truck. But the clerk's response was unusual. That's what they all say at first, but Big Jim's has a way of growing on people. As Rebecca walked back to her truck, she began to notice things that hadn't registered during her initial arrival. The other truckers in the parking lot were moving very slowly and deliberately, almost like they were sleepwalking. Several drivers were just standing beside their trucks, not doing anything productive, just staring off into the distance. When Rebecca tried to make eye contact or wave at fellow drivers, they either didn't respond or gave her blank stares that seemed to look right through her. Rebecca decided she wanted to leave immediately. But when she climbed into her truck and tried to start the engine, nothing happened. All her electrical systems were working, lights, radio, dashboard, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Rebecca had been driving this truck for 3 years without any mechanical problems, and it had been running perfectly when she arrived at the truck stop. She tried several more times, but the engine remained completely dead. Rebecca went back inside to ask if there was a mechanic on duty, and the same clerk who'd served her earlier seemed unsurprised by the problem. "Oh, that happens sometimes," she said casually. "The elevation here affects some engines. Don't worry. Our maintenance staff can take a look at it in the morning. In the meantime, why don't you get some rest? We have very comfortable sleeping rooms available." Rebecca insisted that she needed to get back on the road immediately and asked if there was anyone who could look at her truck right away. The clerk directed her to a man named Jim, presumably the Big Jim the truck stop was named after, who was sitting in the restaurant section drinking coffee. Jim was a large, friendly-looking man in his 60s who greeted Rebecca warmly and offered to take a look at her truck. Jim followed Rebecca out to the parking lot and spent about 15 minutes examining her engine. He claimed to have found the problem, a loose electrical connection, and after some tinkering under the hood, Rebecca's engine started immediately. She was grateful for the help and offered to pay Jim for his time, but he refused any payment. "Just remember us when you're driving through again," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Rebecca thanked Jim and prepared to leave. But as she was conducting her pre-trip inspection, she noticed something that made her extremely uncomfortable. Every single truck in the parking lot had the same modification, a small electronic device attached to the engine compartment that she didn't recognize. When she looked closer at her own truck, she found that an identical device had been installed while Jim was fixing her electrical problem. Rebecca didn't know what the device was, but every instinct told her to get away from this truck stop immediately. She carefully removed the device and threw it in a trash can, then quickly left the parking lot without looking back. As she drove away, she checked her rearview mirrors and saw something that confirmed her suspicions. Several trucks were pulling out of the parking lot behind her, forming a convoy that began following her down the highway. Rebecca drove as fast as she safely could, but the convoy of trucks stayed behind her for over 50 miles, always maintaining the same distance. She tried contacting other drivers on her CB radio to report the situation, but all she received in response were cryptic messages like, "You can't leave Big Jim's," and "Come back to the plaza where you belong." The voices on the radio all sounded flat and emotionless, like people speaking against their will. Rebecca finally lost her followers by taking an unexpected exit and driving through a series of back roads until she reached another truck stop that she knew was legitimate. She immediately called the police to report her experience, but when she tried to provide the location of Big Jim's 24-hour plaza, she encountered a problem. According to her GPS and trucking atlas, there was no truck stop at that exit on Interstate 70. The police were polite but skeptical until Rebecca showed them the electronic device she'd removed from her truck. The officers had never seen anything like it and called in specialists from the Missouri State Police to examine it. The device turned out to be a sophisticated tracking and control system that could remotely monitor and disable vehicle engines. The technology was far more advanced than anything commercially available, and investigators were unable to determine who had manufactured it. Rebecca provided detailed directions to the truck stop's location, and police conducted an investigation the following day. What they found was an empty lot with the concrete foundations of a truck stop that had been demolished over 20 years earlier. Local records showed that a facility called Big Jim's Plaza had operated at that location in the 80s and 90s before closing permanently after the owner, James Big Jim Morrison, died in a trucking accident in 1999. Further investigation revealed that Rebecca was not the first driver to report encountering the phantom truck stop. Over the past 15 years, Missouri State Police had received at least 8 similar reports from truckers who claimed to have stopped at Big Jim's 24-hour plaza, only to discover later that the facility didn't exist. In each case, the drivers described having mechanical problems that were mysteriously resolved by a helpful man named Jim, and several reported finding unknown electronic devices attached to their trucks. Most disturbing of all, police discovered that 3 truckers who had reported stopping at the phantom truck stop had subsequently disappeared while driving through Missouri. Their trucks were found abandoned at various locations along Interstate 70 with no trace of the drivers and no indication of what had happened to them. 6 months after her encounter, Rebecca received a postcard in the mail with a picture of Big Jim's 24-hour plaza and a message that read, "We miss you at Big Jim's. Your sleeping room is still available whenever you're ready to come home." The postcard was postmarked from a Missouri post office, but when Rebecca contacted postal authorities, they had no record of the postcard being processed through their system. James Mitchell had been driving for 13 years and specialized in hauling high-value items that required extra security and careful handling. Artwork, antiques, and collectibles for auction houses and private collectors. November 2020. James was contracted to transport a collection of antique furniture from an estate sale in Savannah, Georgia, to a private collector in Portland, Oregon. The shipper was an elderly man named Harrison Blackwood, who claimed to be liquidating his late father's estate. The furniture pieces were reportedly from the 1800s and included several bedroom sets, dining room furniture, and what Blackwood described as a very special armoire that's been in my family for generations. James arrived at the pickup location, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Savannah that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The house was surrounded by overgrown gardens and seemed to loom over the landscape despite the bright afternoon sunshine. Blackwood met James at the door and immediately struck him as an odd character, extremely pale, soft-spoken and insistent that the furniture be loaded in a very specific order, with the armoire placed at the very front of the trailer. What struck James as unusual was how cold the furniture felt. Even though it had been sitting in a house with no air conditioning during a warm Georgia day, each piece seemed to absorb heat rather than radiate it, and James found himself shivering every time he handled the items directly. The armoire that Blackwood had mentioned was particularly unsettling. It was a massive piece, nearly 8 feet tall and made of dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The piece was ornately carved with figures that appeared to be angels and demons intertwined in various poses. What made James uncomfortable was that the carved figures seemed to change depending on the angle from which you viewed them. What looked like an angel from one side appeared demonic from another. Blackwood insisted that the armoire remain locked during transport and gave James a very specific warning. Under no circumstances should you open this piece or allow anyone else to examine it. The lock is there for everyone's protection. James began his cross-country journey late in the afternoon. For the first few hours, everything seemed normal, but as darkness fell, James began to notice unusual sounds coming from his trailer. At first, he attributed the noises to normal settling and shifting of the furniture. But as he listened more carefully, the sounds became distinctly unsettling. It sounded like wood creaking and groaning, but not from road vibration or temperature changes. The sounds were rhythmic and purposeful, like someone was moving around inside the trailer. James pulled over at a rest area around midnight to check his load securement, and what he found made his blood run cold. Several of the smaller furniture pieces had moved from their original positions despite being properly tied down with heavy-duty straps. More disturbing was the condition of the armoire. The massive piece remained in its original position, but the lock that Blackwood had been so concerned about was now hanging open. James was certain that the lock had been secure when they loaded the piece, and there was no way it could have opened accidentally during transport. James approached the armoire cautiously and noticed that the carved figures on its surface seemed more pronounced in the dim light of the rest area, their expressions appearing more sinister and lifelike. James decided not to investigate further and quickly resecured the load before getting back on the road. But the sounds from the trailer continued throughout the night, becoming more pronounced and disturbing. James began to hear what sounded like voices. Muffled conversations coming from inside the armoire, as if multiple people were trapped inside and trying to communicate with each other. Around 3 a.m, while driving through a remote section of Arkansas, James heard something that made him slam on his brakes and pull over immediately. From his trailer came the unmistakable sound of a woman screaming. Not a brief cry, but a prolonged, agonized scream that seemed to come from inside the armoire itself. James sat in his idling truck for several minutes, listening, but the trailer had gone completely silent. James called the number that Blackwood had given him for emergencies, but the phone was disconnected. He tried calling the auction house in Portland that was supposed to receive the furniture, but they'd never heard of Harrison Blackwood or any furniture deliveries scheduled from Georgia. James was beginning to realize that he might have been deceived about the nature of his cargo and the legitimacy of the delivery. As James sat in his truck trying to decide what to do, he noticed movement in his side mirrors. The armoire, which was positioned near the front of his trailer where he could see it through his rear window, appeared to be rocking back and forth slightly. The movement was subtle but consistent, as if something inside the massive piece was trying to get out. James also noticed that the temperature around his truck was dropping rapidly despite the mild Arkansas weather. James decided to continue driving and contact police at the next major town, but as he prepared to pull back onto the highway, he heard a voice calling his name. The voice was coming from his trailer, clear and distinct. "James, please help us. We've been trapped in here for so long. Please open the door and let us out." The voice was that of a young woman, and it sounded desperate and pleading. James ignored the voice and continued driving. But the pleas continued throughout the night. He heard multiple voices, men, women, and children, all begging to be released from the armoire. They claimed to have been trapped for decades, some for over a century, and they described the interior of the armoire as a place of endless darkness and cold. What made the voices particularly disturbing was their knowledge of details about James's life. They mentioned his wife by name, described his house, and knew about his trucking route preferences. By dawn, James was exhausted and terrified, but he was determined to reach a major city where he could get help from law enforcement. As he drove through Oklahoma, the voices from the armoire became more insistent and threatening. They began to describe what would happen to James if he didn't release them, detailing how they would follow him home and torment his family. The voices also began to affect his truck's electronics. His radio would tune itself to static-filled stations. His GPS would display impossible locations, and his engine would randomly lose power for several seconds at a time. James pulled into a truck stop in Oklahoma City and immediately called the police. While waiting for officers to arrive, James noticed that other truckers in the parking lot were giving his truck a wide berth. Several drivers approached him to ask if everything was all right, explaining that they could hear screaming coming from his trailer and that the temperature around his truck was noticeably colder than the surrounding area. When police arrived and opened James's trailer to inspect the furniture, they found something that defied explanation. Every piece of furniture had moved from its secured position and was now arranged in a perfect circle around the armoire, as if the pieces had repositioned themselves during transport. The armoire itself was standing open, revealing an interior that appeared to be much larger than the external dimensions of the piece would allow. Inside the armoire, police found dozens of personal items: jewelry, photographs, clothing, and identification documents dating back to the 1800s. All of the items belonged to people who had been reported missing over the past 150 years, many of them from the Savannah area. Most disturbing of all, the items showed no signs of age or deterioration, as if they'd been preserved in some kind of temporal bubble. Police contacted authorities in Savannah to investigate Harrison Blackwood and the Victorian mansion where James had picked up the furniture. What they discovered was that the house had been abandoned since 1987, when the last known resident, Harrison Blackwood Sr., had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Further investigation revealed that the armoire had a documented history of being associated with disappearances. Historical records showed that the piece had belonged to a wealthy Savannah family in the 1850s and that over a dozen people had vanished while the armoire was in their possession. The piece had been sold and resold numerous times over the years, and each owner had eventually abandoned it after experiencing supernatural phenomena. James was released without charges once police confirmed that he'd been deceived about the nature of his cargo. The furniture was taken into evidence and eventually transferred to a team of paranormal investigators who specialized in haunted objects. The armoire and the other pieces were eventually destroyed in a controlled burn, but witnesses reported that the fire burned with an unusual blue flame and that screaming could be heard coming from the flames until the furniture was completely consumed. 6 months after the incident, James received a package in the mail containing a small wooden figurine carved in the same style as the decorations on the armoire. The figurine bore an uncanny resemblance to James himself. Attached to it was a note that read, "Thank you for your service. The collection continues to grow, and we always need reliable transportation." The package had no return address and a postmark from Savannah, but postal authorities had no record of it being processed through their system. Patricia Williams had been hauling freight for 16 years and prided herself on her punctuality and reliability. Patricia was known throughout the industry as someone who could deliver any load on the time, regardless of weather, traffic, or mechanical problems. March 2022. Patricia received a call from her dispatcher about an urgent delivery that needed to be completed within a very tight time frame. The cargo was medical equipment being transported from a pharmaceutical company in Ohio to a research hospital in Nevada. The shipper was willing to pay premium rates for expedited delivery, and Patricia's truck was equipped with the climate control systems necessary to maintain the precise temperature requirements for the sensitive equipment. The pickup went smoothly at a modern pharmaceutical facility outside of Columbus. The cargo consisted of several large crates containing what the shipping documents described as experimental diagnostic equipment worth over $2 million. Patricia began her journey westward on Interstate 70, planning to drive straight through to Nevada, with only brief stops for fuel and mandatory rest breaks. For the first 8 hours of the trip, everything proceeded normally. Patricia made good time through Ohio and into Indiana, maintaining the required temperature in her trailer and monitoring the cargo status through a sophisticated tracking system that had been installed by the pharmaceutical company. Patricia was actually running ahead of schedule when she entered Illinois around 10 at night. That's when Patricia encountered something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about time and space. She was driving through a particularly unremarkable stretch of Interstate 70 near Effingham, Illinois, a straight, flat section of highway that she'd traveled dozens of times over the years. The area was rural farmland with few landmarks, just mile markers indicating her progress westward. Patricia noticed that she was approaching mile marker 159. But as she continued driving at a steady 65 miles per hour for what felt like at least 10 minutes, she was surprised to see mile marker 159 approaching again. Patricia assumed she'd been mistaken about the first marker and continued driving. But when she passed mile marker 159 for the third time, she knew something was seriously wrong. Patricia pulled over and consulted her GPS systems. She had 3 different units installed in her truck for redundancy. All 3 devices showed her location as mile marker 159 on Interstate 70 in Illinois. According to the GPS, she was traveling westbound at highway speed, but her position wasn't changing. The devices showed her truck moving along the highway, but somehow she remained at the exact same location no matter how far she drove. Patricia tried calling her dispatcher to report the navigation equipment malfunction, but her cell phone showed no signal despite being in an area where she'd always had good coverage before. Her CB radio was receiving only static, and even her satellite communication system couldn't establish a connection. Patricia was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a single mile of highway that seemed to repeat endlessly. At first, Patricia thought she might be experiencing some kind of medical emergency, a stroke or seizure that was affecting her perception of time and space. She pulled over and conducted a thorough self-assessment, checking her vision, coordination, and mental clarity. Everything seemed normal. She felt completely alert and oriented. Her truck systems were all functioning normally as well, with no indication of mechanical problems or electrical malfunctions. Patricia decided to continue driving and see if the problem would resolve itself. But after an hour of steady travel, she was still passing the same mile marker, 159, every few minutes. The landscape around her never changed. The same farmhouses, the same grove of trees, the same advertising billboard for a local restaurant. It was as if she was driving through a loop of highway that connected to itself, creating an endless circle with no exit. The psychological effect of the repetition was more disturbing than Patricia had anticipated. She began to recognize every detail of the landscape: a red barn with a missing board, a dead tree with distinctive twisted branches, a rusted farm implement abandoned in a field. Each time she passed these landmarks, they appeared in exactly the same condition, as if time had stopped for everything except her truck. Patricia tried various strategies to break free from the loop. She attempted to exit the highway, but every off-ramp led to roads that curved back to the same mile marker, 159. She tried driving in reverse, but the highway behind her was identical to the highway ahead, an endless repetition of the same mile of asphalt. She even tried driving across the median to travel in the opposite direction, but somehow she found herself still heading westbound toward mile marker 159. After several hours of being trapped in the loop, Patricia began to notice subtle changes in her cargo. The temperature monitoring system was showing fluctuations that shouldn't have been possible given the stable climate control settings. More disturbing was the sound coming from the cargo area, a low humming noise that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her truck's engine. Patricia checked the cargo bay and discovered that the crates containing the medical equipment were glowing with a faint blue light that pulsed in the same rhythm as the humming sound. The shipping documents had made no mention of any luminescent properties, and Patricia was certain the glow hadn't been present when the cargo was loaded. As she watched, the glow seemed to be getting brighter and the pulsing more rapid. That's when Patricia realized that her situation might be connected to the experimental equipment she was hauling. The pharmaceutical company had been deliberately vague about the exact nature of the medical devices, referring to them only as diagnostic equipment in the shipping documents. But the sophisticated loading procedures and the extreme security measures suggested that the cargo was far more significant than routine medical supplies. Patricia's CB radio suddenly crackled to life. A voice, clear as day, came through on channel 19. "Eastbound driver trapped in the loop. This is Bobby. I've been where you are. The cargo you're hauling. It's not medical equipment, it's time manipulation technology. You need to disconnect the monitoring device they installed in your truck, or you'll be stuck here forever like me." Patricia searched her truck and found a sophisticated electronic device wired into her electrical system, something that hadn't been there before the pickup. She managed to disconnect it and immediately felt a disorienting sensation of time snapping back into normal flow. The landscape around her suddenly looked different, older and more weathered, as if years had passed in the outside world while she was trapped in the loop. Her GPS systems came back online and showed that she was indeed at mile marker 139, but the date display indicated that 3 weeks had passed since she'd first entered the temporal distortion. Patricia immediately contacted authorities and reported her experience. But when investigators arrived at the pharmaceutical company facility in Ohio, they found it abandoned with no trace of the organization that had hired her. The most unsettling discovery was that Patricia wasn't the only driver to report this type of experience. The FBI had received 17 similar reports over the past 5 years from truckers who claimed to have been trapped in temporal loops while hauling cargo for various pharmaceutical and research companies. In each case, the truckers had lost several days or weeks of time, and the companies that had hired them had disappeared without a trace. Patricia returned to trucking, but now specializes in identifying and avoiding potentially dangerous cargo. She still receives occasional communications from Bobby and other drivers who claim to be trapped in temporal loops. These messages come through her CB radio at random intervals, usually late at night when she's driving through remote areas. The voices always warn her about new shipping companies and cargo types that might be connected to the experimental program, and they beg her to find a way to rescue them from their endless repetition. Kevin Martinez had been driving cross-country for 12 years and was known for his exceptional memory and attention to detail. Kevin could recall specific routes, truck stops, and road conditions from years earlier with photographic precision. August 2021. Kevin received an unusual contract through his dispatcher, a high-paying delivery job that required a driver with an impeccable safety record and the ability to handle confidential cargo. The job involved transporting research materials from a biotechnology company in Virginia to what was described as a memory research facility in rural Montana. The pay was exceptional, nearly 4 times Kevin's normal rate. Kevin picked up the cargo at a modern biotechnology facility outside of Richmond, where he was met by scientists in white lab coats who supervised the loading of dozens of small containers filled with what appeared to be biological samples. What struck Kevin as unusual was the paperwork accompanying the shipment. Instead of normal shipping documents, Kevin received a thick folder filled with psychological assessment forms, memory evaluation tests, and what appeared to be brain scan images. When Kevin asked about the unusual documentation, the lead scientist explained that the research facility required detailed background information about all drivers who delivered to their location, ostensibly for security clearance purposes. Kevin completed the required forms and assessments, which included detailed questions about his driving history, his ability to recall specific routes and experiences, and even questions about childhood memories and family history. The process took over 2 hours. Kevin began his journey westward, taking Interstate 64 through Virginia and Kentucky, before connecting to Interstate 70 through Missouri and into Colorado. The first day of driving was completely normal. Kevin made excellent time while carefully monitoring the temperature-controlled cargo, but as he entered his second day on the road, Kevin began to experience something that he initially attributed to fatigue: brief gaps in his memory of the journey. At first, the memory lapses were minor. Kevin would realize that he couldn't remember passing through a particular town or taking a specific exit, even though his logbook and GPS records showed that he'd traveled those routes. Kevin had never experienced memory problems before and prided himself on his ability to recall every detail of his trips. So these gaps were immediately concerning. As Kevin continued westward, the memory lapses became more frequent and more significant. He would find himself at truck stops with no memory of how he'd gotten there or why he'd decided to stop. His logbook showed entries in his own handwriting for events he couldn't remember, and his fuel receipts indicated purchases he had no recollection of making. It was as if portions of his journey were being erased from his mind as soon as they occurred. Kevin tried calling his dispatcher to report the memory problems, but every time he attempted to make the call, he would forget why he was calling before the number finished dialing. He would find his phone in his hand with no memory of picking it up, or discover that he'd been in the middle of conversations he couldn't remember starting. The memory loss was becoming so severe that Kevin was beginning to question his ability to safely operate his truck. The situation became truly disturbing when Kevin realized that he wasn't just losing memories of the current trip. He was losing memories from throughout his entire driving career. Routes that he'd traveled hundreds of times suddenly seemed unfamiliar. Truck stops where he'd been a regular customer for years felt like places he'd never seen before. It was as if his entire professional experience was being systematically erased from his mind. Kevin pulled over at a rest area in Colorado to assess his situation and discovered something that terrified him. His normally meticulous logbooks, which he'd maintained for over 12 years, now contained entries he didn't remember writing and references to trips he couldn't recall taking. More disturbing was that some of the entries described deliveries to the same Montana research facility he was currently traveling to. Deliveries that Kevin had apparently made multiple times, but had no memory of completing. As Kevin studied his logbooks more carefully, he found evidence of dozens of trips to the Montana facility over the past several years. Each trip was associated with the same type of biological cargo he was currently hauling, and each trip was followed by increasingly detailed medical and psychological assessments. According to his own records, Kevin had been regularly transporting materials to this facility and undergoing extensive testing, but he had no conscious memory of any of these previous deliveries. Kevin tried to call the biotechnology company that had hired him, but when he dialed the number on his contract, he discovered it was disconnected. He attempted to research the company online using his phone, but every search returned no results, as if the organization had never existed. Kevin was beginning to realize that he might be involved in something far more sinister than a routine research delivery. That evening, while Kevin was sleeping in his truck at a rest area in Utah, he was awakened by voices outside his cab. Through his window, he could see two people in white lab coats examining his truck and discussing his cargo in technical terms he didn't understand. One of them was making notes on a clipboard, while the other was apparently taking readings from some kind of electronic device pointed at Kevin's trailer. Kevin remained perfectly still and listened to their conversation, which revealed the horrifying truth about his situation. The researchers were discussing Kevin's memory extraction progress and noting that his cognitive baseline was deteriorating according to their expectations. They referred to Kevin as Subject 47 and mentioned that he was scheduled for final processing when he reached the Montana facility. The researchers explained to each other that Kevin had been selected months earlier as a test subject for experimental memory extraction technology. The biological samples he was transporting weren't research materials at all. They were extracted memories and experiences from previous trucker subjects who had been processed at the Montana facility. Kevin's repeated trips to the facility had allowed researchers to gradually extract his memories of the road while replacing them with artificial experiences designed to keep him functioning as a driver. According to the conversation Kevin overheard, the research facility was developing technology to harvest and transfer human memories, particularly the specialized knowledge and experience of professional drivers. The extracted memories could then be implanted into other subjects or stored digitally for later use. The trucking industry provided an ideal testing ground because drivers often worked alone and traveled long distances, making them easy to manipulate without detection. The researchers discussed Kevin's case specifically, noting that his exceptional memory and extensive driving experience made him a particularly valuable subject. They'd been extracting his memories gradually over multiple trips to avoid detection, but they were now ready to complete the process by removing all of his remaining memories and repurposing his accumulated knowledge for their research. Kevin realized that he was being transported to the facility not as a driver delivering cargo, but as cargo himself. A test subject scheduled for final memory extraction that would likely leave him in a vegetative state. The biological samples in his trailer were the extracted memories of other drivers who had undergone the same process, and Kevin was unknowingly transporting the stolen experiences of his fellow truckers to be stored or implanted into new subjects. After the researchers left, Kevin immediately started his truck and fled the rest area, abandoning his planned route to the Montana facility. But as he drove through the night, Kevin discovered that his memory problems were accelerating rapidly. He began losing memories of recent events within minutes of their occurrence, and his knowledge of trucking procedures and road navigation was deteriorating so quickly that he was becoming unsafe to drive. Kevin managed to reach a hospital in Salt Lake City before his memory loss became completely debilitating. Medical staff found his story incredible, but were alarmed by the rapid progression of his symptoms. Brain scans revealed unusual patterns of neural activity that were consistent with artificial memory manipulation, but the technology involved was beyond anything in current medical literature. While Kevin was being evaluated at the hospital, investigators discovered that his truck's cargo was indeed biological material, but it wasn't stored in normal preservation medium. The samples were suspended in a synthetic fluid that contained complex neural networks and what appeared to be digitized brain activity patterns. Each container held what researchers described as crystallized memories that could potentially be transferred to other subjects under the right conditions. The investigation into the memory extraction operation revealed a sophisticated network involving multiple biotechnology companies and research facilities across the country. Truckers were being systematically targeted and recruited for fake delivery jobs that allowed researchers to study their memories and gradually extract their accumulated knowledge and experience. Kevin's condition stabilized after several weeks of treatment, but his memory never fully recovered. He retained basic life skills and personal memories, but his entire professional knowledge of trucking was gone. He couldn't remember how to operate a commercial vehicle, had no knowledge of routes or regulations, and felt no familiarity with the industry he'd worked in for over a decade. It was as if 12 years of his life had been surgically removed from his mind. Kevin never returned to trucking but has become an advocate for driver safety and rights. He works with law enforcement agencies to identify suspicious shipping companies and delivery requests that might be connected to the memory extraction network. He's also part of a support group for drivers who have experienced unexplained memory loss, many of whom report similar stories of fake delivery jobs and mysterious research facilities. The investigation into the memory extraction operation remains active, but authorities have struggled to locate the main research facility or identify the individuals responsible for the program. Kevin still receives occasional communications from what appear to be other victims of the memory extraction program. These messages come in the form of phone calls from drivers who claim to be experiencing memory loss and confusion about deliveries they can't remember making. The callers often describe symptoms identical to Kevin's experience, and they frequently mention being contracted for deliveries to research facilities that don't appear on any official records. Michael Torres had been driving long haul for 14 years and was known throughout the industry for his reliability and professional reputation. December 2021. Michael was contracted for what appeared to be a routine medical supply delivery from a pharmaceutical distribution center in Arizona to a private medical facility in northern Alaska. The unusual aspect of the job was the remote destination. The facility was located over 200 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a single unpaved road that required special permits and winter driving equipment. The pay was extraordinary, nearly 10 times Michael's normal rate, justified by the extreme isolation and harsh winter conditions. The cargo consisted of medical equipment and supplies sealed in temperature-controlled containers, along with what the shipping documents described as biological research materials that required careful handling and precise environmental control. The pickup process at the Arizona facility was more extensive than Michael had expected. In addition to loading the cargo, Michael was required to undergo a comprehensive medical examination that included blood tests, brain scans, and detailed psychological assessments. The medical staff explained that these procedures were required for anyone entering the Alaska facility due to biosecurity protocols and the sensitive nature of the research being conducted there. Michael found the medical examination unusually thorough and invasive, but he assumed it was standard procedure for high-security research facilities. The examination included detailed measurements of his physical characteristics, vocal pattern analysis, and even genetic testing that required multiple tissue samples. The entire process took over 8 hours. Michael began his journey northward, driving through Nevada, Idaho, and into Canada before crossing into Alaska. The first several days of travel were routine, and Michael made good time despite increasingly harsh weather conditions as he traveled into the Arctic. But as he approached the final stretch of his journey, the 200-mile unpaved road to the research facility, Michael began to notice unusual radio transmissions on his CB. The transmissions weren't normal trucker chatter, but rather technical discussions between people who seemed to be monitoring Michael's progress. The conversations included detailed information about his location, his cargo status, and even personal details about his driving habits and route preferences. Most disturbing was that the people on the radio referred to Michael by a numerical designation, subject M47, rather than his name. Michael tried to respond to the radio transmissions, but whenever he keyed his microphone, the conversations would immediately stop. The monitoring seemed to be one way, with the unknown observers tracking Michael's every move while remaining hidden from his attempts to communicate. As Michael approached the research facility, the radio transmissions became more frequent and more specific. The observers were discussing Michael's compatibility rating and noting that his baseline measurements matched their requirements within acceptable parameters. They also mentioned that the replacement procedure had been approved and that Integration Team Alpha was standing by for Michael's arrival. Michael had no idea what any of these terms meant, but the clinical nature of the discussions made him increasingly uncomfortable. He began to suspect that the medical examination in Arizona had been more than just a security clearance and that he might be walking into a situation far more dangerous than a routine delivery. The research facility itself was unlike anything Michael had ever seen. Instead of a normal medical building, the complex consisted of several interconnected structures built into the side of a mountain, with most of the facility apparently underground. The surface buildings were heavily fortified and surrounded by security fences and guard towers. The entire complex had the appearance of a military installation rather than a medical research center. Michael was met at the facility's gate by security personnel who conducted another thorough inspection of his truck and cargo before allowing him to proceed to the loading dock. The unloading process was supervised by technicians in full biological containment suits, and Michael was required to remain in a designated waiting area while his cargo was transferred to the facility's interior systems. While waiting for the cargo transfer to be completed, Michael overheard conversations between facility staff that revealed the terrifying truth about the research being conducted at the location. The facility wasn't involved in medical research at all. It was a cloning and replacement center where perfect duplicates of selected individuals were being created for purposes that Michael couldn't fully comprehend from the fragments of conversation he heard. According to what Michael overheard, the facility had been operating for several years and had successfully created and deployed hundreds of human duplicates. The targets for replacement were carefully selected based on their professional skills, social connections, and access to sensitive information or strategic locations. Truckers were particularly valuable targets because their nomadic lifestyle made their disappearances less likely to be noticed, and their knowledge of transportation networks could be exploited for various illegal purposes. Michael realized with growing horror that he hadn't been hired to deliver cargo to the facility. He'd been lured there to be replaced by a duplicate. The extensive medical examination in Arizona had been used to create a detailed biological profile that would allow the facility to grow a perfect clone with all of his memories, skills, and physical characteristics. The biological research materials he'd transported were probably genetic samples and neural mapping data from other truckers who had already been processed. Michael tried to leave the facility immediately, but he discovered that his truck had been disabled while he was in the waiting area. The facility security staff politely but firmly explained that he would need to remain overnight while final processing was completed. Michael was escorted to what was described as guest quarters, but the room was clearly a holding cell with reinforced doors and no windows. During the night, Michael could hear activity throughout the facility. Machinery operating, people moving through corridors, and what sounded like construction or assembly work. Most disturbing were the voices he heard in adjacent rooms. Voices that sounded exactly like his own voice, having conversations he'd never had. Michael realized that his duplicate was already being prepared and programmed with artificial memories designed to allow it to seamlessly replace him. Michael managed to escape from his holding cell by using a maintenance access panel he discovered hidden behind a ventilation grate. As he moved through the facility's service corridors, he encountered something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Dozens of growth chambers containing partially developed human clones in various stages of completion. Each chamber was labeled with detailed information about the original person being duplicated, including truckers, government officials, and business executives. Most horrifying was what Michael found in the facility's storage areas. Hundreds of containers filled with what appeared to be discarded human remains. According to the labels on the containers, these were the original biological materials from people who had been successfully replaced by their duplicates. The facility wasn't just creating clones, it was systematically murdering the original people and disposing of their bodies after the replacement process was complete. Michael located his truck in the facility's garage and discovered that it had been equipped with additional monitoring and control systems that would allow the facility to track and manipulate his movements if his duplicate was deployed. He also found evidence that many other truckers had delivered to this facility over the years and that their trucks had been similarly modified before their duplicates were sent back into the world. Michael managed to escape from the facility by creating a distraction in the power distribution system that temporarily disabled the security systems. As he drove away from the complex, he could see search teams being deployed to recapture him, but his knowledge of winter driving in extreme conditions allowed him to evade pursuit and reach civilization. Michael immediately contacted federal authorities and reported his experience, but the investigation that followed was both frustrating and terrifying. When law enforcement agencies attempted to locate the facility, they found only an abandoned research station that had been hastily evacuated. The underground portions of the complex had been sealed with explosives, and all evidence of the cloning operation had been removed or destroyed. Most disturbing was what investigators discovered when they began checking on other truckers who had made deliveries to remote facilities in recent years. Over 40 drivers who had accepted similar high-paying jobs to isolated locations had returned from their deliveries exhibiting subtle changes in personality and behavior. Family members and close friends reported that these drivers seemed different in ways that were difficult to define but impossible to ignore. Medical examinations of these drivers revealed anomalies that were consistent with advanced cloning technology. DNA tests showed microscopic genetic markers that shouldn't have been present in naturally conceived humans, and brain scans revealed neural patterns that suggested artificial memory implantation. Most of the affected drivers had no memory of anything unusual about their deliveries and insisted that they were the same people they'd always been. Michael underwent extensive testing and was confirmed to be genetically authentic, but investigators warned him that his duplicate was almost certainly still in operation somewhere. The clone would have all of Michael's memories up to the point of the medical examination in Arizona, along with artificially implanted experiences designed to explain the gap in its memory. The duplicate would be virtually indistinguishable from Michael himself, and would be operating in the trucking industry with access to all of Michael's professional contacts and reputation. Michael retired from trucking immediately after his escape and now works with federal agencies to identify potential cloning operations and locate other victims of the replacement program. The most chilling aspect of Michael's story is the ongoing uncertainty about how many people in various professions have been replaced by duplicates without anyone's knowledge. The technology demonstrated at the Alaska facility was decades ahead of publicly known cloning capabilities, suggesting that the replacement program has been operating for much longer than investigators initially suspected. Michael continues to receive reports from other truckers about suspicious delivery jobs and unusual medical examinations required for certain contracts. These reports suggest that the replacement program is still active and continues to target professional drivers for reasons that aren't fully understood. Several of Michael's longtime trucking contacts have reported receiving visits from someone claiming to be Michael, someone who looked and sounded exactly like him, but knew details about recent jobs and experiences that the real Michael had never had. His duplicate was apparently operating in the trucking industry, possibly taking jobs and building relationships that could eventually be used to access sensitive cargo or strategic transportation networks. Sarah Mitchell had been driving long haul for 18 years and had unknowingly encountered elements from every nightmare that truckers whisper about in the darkness. November 2022. Sarah received a call from a dispatcher she'd never worked with before, offering her the highest-paying contract of her career. The job involved transporting what was described as archived research materials from a storage facility in Nevada to a destination that would be provided to her en route. The pay was astronomical, nearly $50,000 for a single delivery. But the contract included unusual clauses requiring absolute secrecy and forbidding her from discussing the cargo or destination with anyone. The pickup location was a massive warehouse complex in the Nevada desert, surrounded by military-style security and accessible only through multiple checkpoints. Sarah was required to undergo extensive background verification and sign documents she wasn't allowed to read before being escorted to the loading dock. The cargo consisted of hundreds of file boxes, computer servers, and what appeared to be biological preservation equipment. As the cargo was being loaded, Sarah overheard conversations between the facility staff that made her blood run cold. They were discussing something called Project Night Road, an ongoing operation that had been collecting data on supernatural encounters, unexplained phenomena, and what they called dimensional incursions along America's highway system for over 30 years. According to what Sarah heard, every strange encounter that truckers had reported wasn't only real, It was part of a coordinated experiment being conducted by an organization with unlimited resources and technology far beyond public knowledge. The loading supervisor, apparently unaware that Sarah could hear him, explained to a colleague that the archived materials contained documentation of thousands of trucker encounters with ghosts, time loops, phantom truck stops, and other supernatural phenomena. But these weren't random occurrences. They were carefully orchestrated tests designed to study how ordinary people responded to impossible situations. The organization had been using the trucking industry as a testing ground for experimental technology that could manipulate reality, time, memory, and human consciousness. Sarah realized that she wasn't just transporting research files. She was carrying evidence of the most massive psychological and supernatural experiment in human history. Every story of ghostly encounters, every report of phantom locations, every account of missing drivers, all of it had been part of this project. The organization had been systematically terrorizing truckers for decades while collecting data on human responses to supernatural trauma. As Sarah began her journey, she received her destination coordinates through an encrypted communication system that had been installed in her truck during loading. The destination was a facility in the Colorado mountains that she was to reach within 72 hours. But as Sarah drove through the night, she began to experience elements from every supernatural encounter she'd ever heard about from fellow truckers. First, she encountered phantom trucks that followed her across Nevada in perfect formation, 3 older model semis that maintained the exact same distance behind her, no matter how she adjusted her speed. When Sarah tried to contact them on her CB radio, she heard the voices of drivers who'd been dead for decades, all of them begging her to turn around and abandon her delivery. As Sarah entered Utah, her GPS began directing her onto roads that didn't exist on any map, leading her through a landscape that seemed to shift and change as she drove. She passed abandoned towns filled with people in nightgowns who watched her truck with hungry eyes, and she heard voices on her radio describing road conditions from decades in the past. The psychological pressure intensified as Sarah drove through Colorado. She picked up a hitchhiker who appeared to be a young woman in distress, but who revealed herself as something inhuman with black eyes and pointed teeth. The hitchhiker told Sarah that she was approaching the source of all the supernatural activity that plagued America's highways, a facility where reality itself was being manipulated and tested. Sarah's cargo began making sounds as if something alive was trapped inside the file boxes. When she investigated during a stop, she discovered that the archived materials weren't just documentation of supernatural encounters. They contained actual captured supernatural entities. The organization had been trapping ghosts, demons, and other paranormal beings for use in their experiments on human subjects. As Sarah approached the Colorado facility, she encountered the Phantom Truck Stop, Big Jim's 24-hour plaza, appearing exactly as other drivers had described it. The truck stop staff revealed to Sarah that she'd been selected not just to deliver the archived material, but to become the final test subject in Project Night Road. Her 18 years of driving experience and her reputation for reliability had made her the perfect candidate for the ultimate experiment, a test that would determine whether the organization's reality manipulation technology was ready for deployment on a global scale. Sarah discovered that every supernatural encounter she'd ever heard about was connected to this facility. The antique delivery that trapped drivers in haunted objects. The voice on Channel 19 that provided warnings from beyond the grave. The passenger who wasn't human. The never-ending mile that trapped drivers in time loops. The memory facility that stole drivers' experiences. The replacement program that created perfect duplicates. All of these were different aspects of the same massive experiment. The organization behind Project Night Road wasn't just studying supernatural phenomena. They were creating it using technology that combined advanced science with captured supernatural entities. They'd been testing the limits of human consciousness and reality manipulation, and the ultimate goal was to develop the ability to control human perception and memory on a massive scale, potentially affecting entire populations. Sarah learned that the facility she was approaching served as the central command for all supernatural activity on America's highways. Every ghost truck, every phantom location, every impossible encounter was being orchestrated from this location using a combination of advanced technology and trapped supernatural entities. The organization had essentially weaponized the paranormal, turning it into a tool for studying and controlling human behavior. As Sarah reached the final approach to the facility, she made a decision that would save not only her own life, but potentially the lives of countless other drivers. Instead of delivering the archived materials to the facility, Sarah drove her truck directly into the facility's main building, causing a massive explosion that destroyed decades of research data and released hundreds of trapped supernatural entities. The destruction of the facility created a supernatural shockwave that was felt across the entire highway system. Phantom truck stops disappeared. Time loops collapsed. Trapped spirits were finally freed to move on to whatever comes after death. The sudden cessation of supernatural activity on America's highways was noticed by truckers nationwide, who reported that the roads suddenly felt normal for the first time in decades. Sarah survived the explosion but was severely injured and spent months recovering in a secure medical facility. During her recovery, she was debriefed by federal agents who revealed that Project Night Road had been under investigation for years, but the organization's use of supernatural entities and reality manipulation technology had made conventional investigation impossible. Sarah's destruction of the facility had provided the breakthrough that law enforcement needed to expose the operation. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Project Night Road. The organization had been operating with funding from multiple governments and had facilities on every continent. Their experiments had affected not just truckers, but pilots, ship captains, train engineers, and other transportation professionals worldwide. The goal was to develop the ability to control human consciousness and memory as a tool for social and political manipulation. Sarah's heroic actions had disrupted the organization's operations, but investigators warned that other facilities remained active and that the technology developed through Project Night Road could still be deployed by other groups. The supernatural encounters that had terrorized truckers for decades might have ended, but the human organizations behind them continue to pose a threat to transportation workers and society as a whole. Some say the roads are safe now, that whatever was haunting America's highways has finally been laid to rest. But Sarah knows better. She still receives encrypted messages on her CB radio late at night, warnings from other drivers about new facilities being built in remote locations, about companies offering suspicious contracts, about technology that shouldn't exist. The experiment might be over, but the people who ran it are still out there. And they're always looking for new test subjects. Thanks for listening. If you made it through all 11 stories, you now know what really happens on America's darkest highways. Stay safe out there. Keep your eyes on the road, your doors locked, and remember, not everything you see in your mirrors is really there. And sometimes, the things that aren't there are the ones you should fear most. Retry.